Hello, dear listeners, and thank you for joining us on the English Globe, a place where long, slow, and easy-to-understand conversations help you practice English while also learning about important global topics. And today, we begin with a thoughtful question that many people are asking as energy markets change rapidly around the world. Could Venezuela become a major alternative oil source for the United States?
This topic matters because energy is something every country depends on. And when we talk about energy, we are not only talking about gasoline for cars or fuel for airplanes, but also about electricity, heating, transportation systems, and even the cost of food and products, which means that having reliable oil partners is a key part of protecting a country's economic stability and future growth.
When any country thinks about where it gets its oil, it has to consider more than just price, because governments also focus on whether a partner is reliable, whether shipping routes are safe, and whether long-term supplies can stay stable during moments of global tension or political uncertainty, which is why energy security is one of the most important topics in international relations.
Around the world, nations usually try to avoid depending on a single region for essential resources, because if something unexpected happens in that region, such as a conflict, a natural disaster, or a sudden decision to reduce production, it can create price spikes, fuel shortages, and disruptions that affect millions of people. So countries prefer having multiple partners to reduce risks.
For many decades, the United States received a significant share of imported oil from the Middle East. And although the U.S. also produces a large amount domestically, it still imports certain types of crude that match the technical needs of American refineries, which means that diversification, adding more sources from different regions, continues to be a major part of American energy strategy.
This is where Venezuela enters the discussion, because Venezuela holds some of the largest proven oil reserves in the world, and its geographic position in the Western Hemisphere makes transportation to the United States faster and more cost-effective compared to many distant suppliers, which naturally raises the question of whether deeper cooperation could reduce dependence on other regions.
However, the answer is not simple, because turning natural reserves into stable exports requires functioning infrastructure, skilled labor, investment, and long-term political and economic planning. And Venezuela has experienced years of challenges that affected its production capacity. So understanding this topic requires looking at both the country's enormous potential and the realistic limitations it faces.
Energy markets are also influenced by global events, and in recent years the world has seen disruptions caused by conflicts, pandemics, shipping route problems, and shifts in demand as countries transition toward renewable sources. So when analysts study whether Venezuela could replace Middle Eastern oil, they are really asking whether Venezuela could become a stable and consistent part of a diverse energy mix.
Another point that is important for English learners is understanding how global energy decisions are rarely based on political opinions alone, because governments usually focus on practical needs such as keeping prices stable, supporting industries, and ensuring that citizens have access to fuel, which means energy partnerships often change depending on the market situation and global supply levels.
So, in this episode, we will take a clear and balanced look at America's energy needs, the role of the Middle East in global oil markets, Venezuela's potential strengths and weaknesses, and the realistic possibilities for cooperation between the United States and Venezuela, all explained with simple vocabulary so learners at different levels can follow the ideas comfortably.
By the end of this discussion, listeners will understand how energy security works, why countries avoid relying on just one supplier, and what factors influence decisions about importing oil from different regions. And although the subject may seem complex at first, breaking it into small, understandable pieces can help you feel more confident while learning both English and world affairs.
With that foundation, we can now move forward into deeper explanations about America's current energy needs and why global markets rely on a balanced network of suppliers. Because understanding the basics of energy dependence will make it easier to explore whether Venezuela could truly become a major alternative to Middle Eastern oil in the years ahead.
When people hear that the United States is one of the world's largest oil producers, they are often surprised to learn that the country still imports millions of barrels of oil every day, and this may seem confusing at first, but it becomes understandable when we look at how different types of crude oil, refinery systems, and long-term supply strategies all shape America's overall energy needs in ways that go beyond simple production numbers.
Even though the US produces a huge amount of light crude oil from states like Texas, New Mexico, and North Dakota, many American refineries were built decades ago to process heavier types of crude, which means they are optimized to handle oil that comes from regions such as the Middle East or Latin America, so the country continues importing certain grades of oil because domestic production alone cannot fully match the technical requirements of its refining network.
Another key point is that the United States uses oil across nearly every sector of daily life, including transportation, aviation, agriculture, shipping, manufacturing, construction, and thousands of products made from petroleum. And because demand is so high and constantly changing, relying only on domestic supply would expose the country to greater risks if sudden storms, refinery shutdowns, or unexpected economic events disrupted the flow of fuel.
This is where the idea of energy security becomes important, because energy security means having a stable, flexible, and reliable system that protects a country from sudden shortages, market shocks, or disruptions caused by natural disasters or international events. And to achieve this level of protection, countries like the United States build strategies that combine domestic production, foreign imports, and backup reserves.
One of the tools America uses for stability is the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which is a large emergency stockpile stored in underground salt caverns along the Gulf Coast, and its purpose is to act as a shield during moments when markets experience sudden shortages or major supply interruptions, allowing the government to release oil into the system to keep fuel accessible and prevent severe price spikes for consumers and businesses.
However, the reserve is not meant to replace regular imports or daily production, because it functions more like a safety net than a long-term supply source. And this means the country still needs a steady flow of oil from multiple regions in order to support its economy, transportation systems, and industrial needs. So diversification, having many reliable partners, is a central part of American energy policy.
Another reason the United States continues importing oil is related to global supply chains, because the world's energy system is deeply interconnected, and even though a country may produce large volumes domestically, it still participates in global markets where prices, trade routes, shipping lanes, and supply agreements all influence the movement of oil, which means that no major economy operates completely on its own energy island.
In global markets, oil behaves as a shared commodity, meaning that prices are influenced by worldwide events rather than local production alone. So even if the United States produced more than it needed, the country would still be affected by international trends, because global supply and demand shape everything from fuel prices to investment decisions, making international energy relationships an essential part of long-term planning.
This is why America strengthens partnerships with multiple suppliers, including Canada, Mexico, the Middle East, and sometimes South American countries, because depending too heavily on a single region could create vulnerabilities during times of political tension or unexpected production cuts, and maintaining a broad network of energy relationships helps keep the system stable, predictable, and better prepared for sudden changes.
For English learners, it may help to think of energy supply like a balanced diet, because even if you have plenty of one type of food available at home, you still need variety to stay healthy. And in the same way, a country needs different sources of oil to support the many industries, technologies, and transportation systems that depend on it, which is why the United States continues using both domestic resources and imported supplies.
As we explore this topic further in the episode, it becomes clear that America's continued dependence on global oil imports is not a sign of weakness or lack of production, but rather a deliberate strategy built to maintain stability, reduce risks, and ensure that all sectors of the economy have access to the exact types of fuel they require, which is especially important in a world where energy markets can shift rapidly.
With this understanding of how domestic production, imports, and strategic reserves work together to support America's energy system, we can now move into a deeper discussion about the role the Middle East plays in global oil markets, because understanding why that region remains so influential will help us evaluate whether Venezuela could realistically become a major alternative source for the United States.
When we talk about the global oil system, the Middle East often appears at the center of the conversation, and this is not because of political opinions or dramatic headlines, but simply because the region holds some of the world's largest and most accessible oil reserves, which have shaped the international energy market for decades and continue to influence how prices, supply levels, and long-term energy strategies develop around the world.
To understand why the region remains so important, it helps to look back at how the modern oil industry grew, because Middle Eastern countries discovered vast oil fields long before many other regions developed large-scale production, and their geography allowed companies to extract crude efficiently, refine it near ports, and ship it through major sea routes that connect to Asia, Europe, Africa, and the Americas, creating a global network built around consistent supply.
A major part of this influence comes from OPEC, which stands for the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. And although OPEC includes nations outside the Middle East, several of its founding and most influential members come from the region, and their coordinated decisions, such as adjusting total output or setting production targets, play a huge role in shaping global oil prices and guiding market expectations.
When OPEC members decide to raise or reduce production, they usually call these changes production cuts or production increases, and these decisions matter because they influence the global balance between supply and demand. And when supply becomes tight, prices tend to rise, while increased production often helps stabilize markets. So these coordinated moves become important tools for maintaining predictable conditions in a world where energy demand continues to grow.
One reason OPEC decisions are so impactful is that Middle Eastern oil fields are capable of producing very large quantities at relatively low cost, and this means that countries in the region can scale their production up or down more easily than producers in areas where extraction is more expensive or technically difficult, giving the Middle East a unique position in maintaining market stability, which refers to keeping prices steady and preventing sudden disruptions.
Another factor that strengthens the region's role is the design of global shipping routes, because important waterways like the Strait of Hormuz connect Middle Eastern oil to major parts of the world, and millions of barrels pass through this narrow route daily, making it one of the most critical passages for global trade. So when the region maintains reliable operations, markets experience confidence and stability across many industries.
For English learners, it may help to think of the Middle East as a kind of central hub in the global energy system, because the region supplies many parts of the world simultaneously, and its ability to deliver consistent volumes helps countries plan their budgets, set fuel prices, and operate industries smoothly, which is why even nations that do not rely heavily on Middle Eastern oil directly still feel the effects of changes happening there.
This influence is not only about physical supply, but also about market psychology, because traders, companies, and governments watch the region closely to understand future price trends. And when the Middle East signals increased stability, markets often react calmly. But when uncertainty rises, energy markets may adjust quickly, showing how deeply interconnected global energy planning has become in the modern era.
Another point to consider is that Middle Eastern crude oil is diverse, ranging from light grades to heavier types, which makes it suitable for many different kinds of refineries around the world. And this versatility increases its importance because it helps global buyers match the exact technical requirements of their refining systems, making the region not just a major supplier, but a flexible one as well.
Despite new developments in renewable energy and rising production in countries like the United States, Brazil, and Canada, the Middle East still plays a critical role because global demand for oil remains high, and many countries depend on petroleum for transportation, shipping, aviation, manufacturing, and petrochemical production. So the world continues to rely on the region's large and dependable output to meet long-term needs.
This is why discussions about global energy always include the Middle East, not because of political opinions, but because the region's combination of vast reserves, well-developed export infrastructure, coordinated production policies, and strategic location create a foundation for worldwide energy supply, shaping how nations plan their energy strategies and how industries prepare for future changes in demand.
With this understanding, we can now look more clearly at why countries like the United States explore additional partnerships, including the possibility of expanding energy cooperation with Venezuela. Because diversification is not about replacing one region entirely, but rather about building a more balanced system. And learning how the Middle East fits into that system helps us evaluate Venezuela's potential with greater clarity.
When people talk about the future of global energy, Venezuela often appears in the discussion because the country holds some of the largest proven oil reserves in the world. And these reserves are not small pockets of limited supply, but massive fields that stretch across regions like the Orinoco Belt, giving Venezuela an extraordinary natural advantage that could, in theory, support high levels of production for many decades if developed efficiently.
One of the reasons these reserves are so significant is that they contain what is known as heavy crude, which is a thicker type of oil that requires more processing before it can be turned into usable products like gasoline, diesel, or jet fuel. And although heavy crude can be challenging to refine, many refineries in the United States, especially those along the Gulf Coast, were designed specifically to handle this type of oil, making the U.S. a natural customer for Venezuelan supply.
This connection between heavy crude and American refining capacity is important because even though the United States produces a lot of light crude domestically, its refinery infrastructure was built during a period when heavier oil from Latin America and the Middle East was more common. So the system still benefits from having access to heavy crude sources that match the technical configurations of many large refineries in states like Texas and Louisiana.
Beyond the technical match, geography also gives Venezuela a strategic advantage because the country is located in the Western Hemisphere, meaning shipping routes to the United States are relatively short compared to deliveries from distant regions, and this reduces transportation time, lowers shipping costs, and creates a simpler supply chain, which are all factors that energy planners consider when evaluating long-term partnerships.
Historically, the United States and Venezuela had strong energy ties, and for many years, the U.S. was one of the largest buyers of Venezuelan crude, while Venezuelan companies invested in American refineries to strengthen the connection. And even though the relationship has changed over time, the basic reality remains that the two countries have a long history of cooperation in the oil sector, giving them a shared foundation that could be expanded in the future.
However, having enormous natural reserves does not automatically translate into high levels of production, because producing oil requires functioning infrastructure, which includes pipelines, refineries, storage tanks, transportation networks, and specialized equipment that must be maintained continuously. And in Venezuela's case, many parts of this infrastructure have faced years of underinvestment and aging equipment, making production more difficult.
To understand this clearly, think of infrastructure like a complex machine that needs constant care, because without regular maintenance, the machine slows down, becomes less efficient, and sometimes stops working altogether. And in Venezuela's oil sector, this has meant that wells produce less than they could, refineries operate below capacity, and export terminals require upgrades to handle large volumes safely and consistently.
Another challenge is that heavy crude requires blending or special processing before it can be transported easily. And this often involves mixing it with lighter crude or using upgrading facilities that transform it into a more refined product. But when these upgrading systems operate below their designed capacity, the entire supply chain slows down, which makes it harder for the country to reach the high output levels that its natural reserves would otherwise support.
In addition to infrastructure needs, Venezuela has experienced economic struggles that make large-scale investment more difficult, because developing oil fields, repairing pipelines, and modernizing refineries require significant financial resources, advanced technology, and well-trained professionals. And when these pieces are missing or limited, production slows down, even if the country has enormous geological potential.
It is important to emphasize that this explanation is not a judgment, but simply a practical, technical overview, because oil production depends on a combination of natural resources, economic stability, and engineering capabilities. And when any of those elements face stress, output can fall even in countries with very large reserves, which helps explain why Venezuela's current production is far below its full potential.
Despite these challenges, many experts still believe Venezuela could increase its production significantly if long-term investments, partnerships, and modernization projects take place, because the underlying resource base is massive, and the geographic advantages remain strong, meaning that the country has a foundation that could support a much larger role in regional and global energy markets if infrastructure and technology are strengthened.
For English learners, understanding Venezuela's situation provides a useful example of how natural resources alone do not determine a country's energy role, because factors like refining capacity, infrastructure quality, shipping routes, and economic stability all work together to shape how oil moves from the ground to the global market. And studying these ideas can help listeners understand energy discussions more clearly.
As we move forward in this episode, we will compare Venezuela's current position to the long-standing influence of Middle Eastern producers, which will help us answer the key question of whether Venezuela has the potential to become a major alternative supplier for the United States. And this comparison will show how geography, refinery design, production costs, and long-term trends shape decisions in the modern energy system. When we look at the relationship between the United States and Venezuela in recent years, one of the most interesting developments has been the gradual introduction of limited cooperation in the energy sector. And while this cooperation does not represent a complete return to earlier levels of trade, it shows that both sides recognize the practical value of communication, technical discussions, and temporary arrangements that help stabilize global markets during periods of uncertainty.
These developments often appear in the form of temporary agreements, carefully structured permissions, or specific licenses that allow certain companies to operate under clearly defined conditions. And these arrangements usually focus on activities that support market stability rather than large-scale commercial expansion. Because both countries approach the topic with caution while still acknowledging the benefit of having flexible options in a constantly shifting global energy system.
One of the main reasons these limited steps occur is that the global oil market occasionally faces supply disruptions, production cuts, or unexpected increases in demand. And when these shifts create pressures on price stability, governments sometimes review their policies to ensure they respond effectively to real-world conditions, which is why the United States periodically updates its approach based on practical assessments rather than fixed, unchanging strategies.
For English learners, it might be helpful to think of these policy updates as adjustments to a long-term plan, because countries often build their energy systems the way engineers build a bridge, with strong foundations but with room to make changes when the environment shifts. And in the case of US-Venezuela relations, these adjustments allow the United States to maintain flexibility while also encouraging technical dialogue that supports clear communication.
Another factor that encourages occasional cooperation is the nature of heavy crude oil, because as we explained earlier, many American refineries were designed to process heavier grades, which Venezuela produces in large volumes. And during times when certain global suppliers reduce output, or when transportation routes face interruptions, having access to alternative heavy crude sources helps maintain a balanced flow for refineries that depend on consistent inputs.
Diplomatic conversations also play a major role because energy decisions are rarely made by a single agency or office. Instead, they involve technical experts, economists, environmental specialists, and international negotiators who evaluate risks, opportunities, supply levels, and long-term needs. And these teams sometimes find that limited cooperation with Venezuela can support broader market stability without creating major structural changes in long-term policy.
Part of the reason this balance is important is that the global energy system is deeply interconnected, and unexpected disruptions, such as weather events, refinery outages, or shifts in demand from major economies, can place pressure on markets. So when the United States adjusts its approach to Venezuela, it is often responding to these global signals rather than making decisions based on political preferences or dramatic narratives.
Another important point is that these agreements are typically conditional and time-limited, meaning that they are designed to operate only under specific circumstances and require periodic reviews, which allows policymakers to make decisions based on updated data about supply, demand, prices, and regional stability. And this approach helps ensure that cooperation remains practical, controlled, and aligned with broader economic goals.
Many energy analysts explain that these temporary arrangements offer both sides a way to address immediate needs without committing to long-term structural changes, because Venezuela gains opportunities to maintain or repair certain parts of its energy infrastructure, while the United States gains access to additional supply options that help reduce pressure when other sources become strained, creating a mutually beneficial but carefully managed form of cooperation.
For learners, this moment in US-Venezuela relations provides a useful example of how modern energy policy works in practice, because instead of being shaped only by political statements or public debates, it often develops through technical assessments, market predictions, and risk evaluations carried out by experts who focus on stability. And understanding this helps listeners appreciate the complexity behind decisions that affect worldwide fuel prices and supply chains.
It is also important to remember that these developments do not mean the United States is replacing other suppliers, because energy diversification remains the core principle of its strategy, and cooperation with Venezuela is simply one part of a much larger global network that includes partners in North America, the Middle East, and beyond, showing that energy security is not about choosing a single partner, but about building a balanced system.
As we continue this episode, these details will help us explore whether Venezuela could realistically expand its role in supplying the United States, because understanding recent cooperation, ongoing challenges, and shifting global needs provides essential context. And this background will support a clearer and more thoughtful comparison between what Venezuela can offer today and what the United States continues to receive from other major regions.
When people hear the idea that Venezuela could replace Middle Eastern oil for the United States, it often sounds like a simple and direct possibility, but in reality, the global energy system works more like a giant network of connected pipes, shipping routes, and technology centers, which means that replacing an entire region is extremely difficult. Yet increasing supply from multiple partners, including Venezuela, is very much possible, and understanding this difference helps us see the situation more realistically.
To begin this comparison, it is important to look at production levels, because Middle Eastern countries collectively produce millions of barrels every single day, supported by large fields, modern facilities, and long-established export operations, while Venezuela, despite having huge reserves, currently produces much less due to infrastructure limitations, maintenance needs, and long-term challenges that reduce its ability to operate at the levels that would be required to match Middle Eastern output.
For English learners, one useful analogy is to imagine two water reservoirs. One reservoir is full, with modern pumps and clean pipes that can move water quickly to many neighborhoods, while the second reservoir is also full of water, but has older pipes, slower pumps, and equipment that needs upgrades before it can deliver water at the same speed. And in this comparison, Venezuela is the reservoir that has plenty of water, but cannot yet push it through the system as efficiently.
Another key factor is refinery compatibility, because Venezuelan crude is considered heavy and needs specific types of refineries. Unfortunately, many American refineries, especially along the Gulf Coast, were built to handle this type of oil as part of long-standing trade patterns, which means that Venezuela's crude fits well with US technical designs, while Middle Eastern producers supply a mix of light and medium oil that also blends easily with global refinery systems.
This means Venezuela is not blocked by technology or refinery limitations. Rather, the challenge lies in consistently producing and delivering enough heavy crude to fill the existing capacity, whereas Middle Eastern countries already have steady production levels that meet global demand. So even though Venezuela is a good technical match, it currently cannot provide the same scale of continuous supply needed to replace such a large region.
Shipping distance is another important part of the comparison. And in this category, Venezuela has a clear advantage, because ships traveling from Venezuelan ports to American refineries need only a few days of sailing, while shipments from the Middle East require much longer journeys across the Atlantic or through the Indian Ocean and Suez Canal. And shorter routes mean lower transportation costs, reduced shipping times, and simpler logistics during moments of market tension.
However, shorter shipping routes alone do not outweigh the vast production capacity and long-term reliability that Middle Eastern suppliers have built over many decades, because the global oil system relies on stable, predictable volumes that help markets avoid sudden price spikes, and the Middle East continues to provide that consistency through advanced infrastructure, coordinated production planning, and an established role in stabilizing global supply.
Another helpful analogy is to imagine a large bakery that supplies bread to many cities. The Middle East is like a group of bakeries that produce bread every day at full capacity and deliver it through reliable routes, while Venezuela is like a bakery with excellent ingredients but older ovens and machinery, meaning it could produce a lot more bread if it repaired or replaced equipment, but at the moment, it cannot match the output of the fully modernized facilities.
Long-term potential is where Venezuela becomes especially interesting, because if investments increase, infrastructure is modernized, and production systems are repaired, Venezuela could significantly expand its production, and analysts believe that the country has the geological capacity to supply much larger volumes in the future, which means it could become an important partner for the United States, even if it cannot replace the Middle East entirely.
This idea is important. The question is not whether Venezuela can replace the Middle East, but whether it can become an additional strong partner that adds more diversity to America's energy portfolio. Because energy security improves when a country has multiple sources rather than depending heavily on one region, and Venezuela's location, heavy crude compatibility, and large reserves make it a valuable candidate for such diversification.
The global energy system also depends on market psychology, meaning that stability comes not only from physical supply, but from confidence in future supply, and Middle Eastern producers have maintained that confidence through decades of consistent output, while Venezuela needs time, repairs, investment, and long-term agreements before markets can view it as a supplier capable of providing steady and predictable flows at high levels.
It's worth noting that even the United States, which produces large quantities of oil itself, continues to buy from many countries because different grades of crude are used for different types of products. And having a mix of suppliers helps refine fuel more efficiently, maintain storage levels, and balance fluctuations in domestic production. So increasing imports from Venezuela would strengthen the overall system without requiring a dramatic replacement of Middle Eastern supply.
When we put all of these factors together, production levels, refinery compatibility, shipping distances, infrastructure quality, and investment needs, it becomes clear that Venezuela cannot realistically replace an entire region like the Middle East, but it can absolutely become a more significant contributor to American energy needs, especially if its production systems receive the upgrades needed to enhance output in a steady and sustainable way.
For learners, the simplest way to understand the comparison is this. The Middle East is currently the world's largest and most reliable energy engine, while Venezuela is a powerful engine waiting to be repaired and restarted, and once repaired, it could add valuable support to the global energy network, helping countries like the United States diversify supply and strengthen energy security without expecting one region to completely replace another.
When we talk about cooperation between the United States and Venezuela in the energy sector, it is helpful for learners to imagine a long bridge that connects two places which already understand each other's needs quite well, but still require careful planning, steady construction, and clear communication to support people on both sides. This idea of cooperation is not only about trading oil, it is also about improving infrastructure, creating reliable supply routes, supporting workers, and building confidence in a system that functions smoothly even when the global energy market feels uncertain or unpredictable. Cooperation works best when it has clear goals and benefits that are easy to understand, such as steady production, predictable delivery schedules, and shared investments that improve long-term capacity.
One of the noticeable benefits is that increased cooperation can generate jobs for engineers, technicians, shipping specialists, port workers, and refinery staff, because every large-scale project in the oil industry requires teams of trained professionals who can operate equipment, monitor quality, maintain pipelines, or coordinate transportation. When countries work together, these opportunities often expand, giving communities more stability and encouraging companies to build training programs that help new workers learn valuable technical skills, which can improve local economies while ensuring that the industry remains productive and safe.
Another important advantage involves energy security, which we have been discussing throughout this podcast. Energy security means having access to reliable supplies even during global disruptions, so countries often look for diverse partners rather than depending heavily on any single region. If cooperation with Venezuela increases in a stable, predictable way, it can help the United States balance its energy portfolio. This does not mean replacing one region completely. Instead, it means adding more sources so that any sudden change in one part of the world does not cause major shocks in prices or supply. This steady approach helps businesses plan their costs, helps consumers experience fewer surprises at the fuel pump, and helps the broader economy avoid sudden stress.
A related benefit comes from geography. Because Venezuela is located relatively close to the United States compared to many distant suppliers, transportation times can be shorter, shipping routes can be more direct, and supply chains can sometimes be easier to manage. For English learners, supply chain simply refers to the long process that moves a product from where it is produced to where it is used. When a country is closer, shipping is generally simpler, and there are fewer chances for delays caused by long-distance weather issues, long travel routes, or complicated international pathways. This convenience can make cooperation more attractive to companies that prefer efficiency and reliability.
However, even though there are many potential advantages, it is also important to understand the limits of cooperation, and this is where the picture becomes more complex. One major limitation comes from infrastructure, which includes refineries, pipelines, ports, storage tanks, and maintenance facilities. Infrastructure needs consistent investment, and upgrading or expanding it can take years. Venezuela has huge potential, but some of its facilities require modernization, and without long-term investment, production cannot reach its highest possible level. This does not mean cooperation is impossible, but it does mean progress requires planning, funding, and time.
Another limitation relates to the type of oil that Venezuela produces. As we mentioned earlier, much of it is heavy crude, which requires special processing. Not every refinery is designed to handle this kind of oil, so the United States must consider whether its facilities have the right technology or whether adjustments are necessary. Refinery upgrades can be expensive, and companies must calculate whether the long-term benefits justify the cost. These factors influence how quickly cooperation can expand and how much oil can realistically be processed in the near future.
Global competition also plays a role. Energy markets are connected, and many countries look for reliable buyers and sellers. When demand rises in one region, prices may shift in another. If other nations also want Venezuelan oil, shipping availability, production schedules, and contract priorities can change. This shows why cooperation is not just a two-country issue. It is part of a larger, constantly moving system. For learners, it is helpful to imagine a busy international marketplace where every supplier and customer is adjusting based on price, demand, and timing. This means cooperation can be beneficial, but must always be flexible.
Another limit involves long-term investment. Companies and governments prefer stability when planning major projects. They want to be confident that agreements will last for many years, so that investments in equipment, training, and technology will pay off. Without predictable long-term conditions, big projects might grow slowly. This is why cooperation requires consistent communication, clear agreements, and shared expectations. When these elements are strong, partnerships tend to grow naturally. When they are uncertain, progress can be slower.
Even with these limits, cooperation still holds meaningful opportunities. Improved trade can support regional stability, because countries that work together economically often build routines of communication that reduce misunderstandings and create mutual interests. When supply routes operate smoothly, it encourages companies to innovate, engineers to design better equipment, and workers to gain new skills. These developments benefit not only the energy industry, but also other sectors that rely on stable fuel supplies, such as transportation, manufacturing, and agriculture.
Looking globally, energy markets are deeply interconnected, and this means that even future developments in one region can influence prices, availability, and strategic decisions elsewhere. For example, shifts in Middle Eastern production, renewable energy adoption, or US policy can impact Venezuelan exports, shipping routes, and refinery operations. Learning to think about these connections is helpful not only for understanding international news, but also for improving analytical English skills, because learners can practice connecting cause and effect, using complex sentence structures, and expressing probability or potential outcomes clearly.
Another opportunity for learners comes from exploring careers and education in energy and global studies. The energy sector requires engineers, environmental specialists, policy analysts, economists, logistics managers, and communication experts, and many universities around the world offer programs focused on these fields. For students and professionals, staying informed about current and potential developments in countries like Venezuela provides a practical advantage. They can participate in internships, research projects, or industry collaborations that deepen both knowledge and language skills. Words like opportunity, career, specialist, and collaboration frequently appear in academic and professional contexts, making them valuable additions to an English learner's vocabulary.
At the same time, individuals can enhance their personal knowledge and critical thinking by following energy-related developments, reading news articles, and listening to educational podcasts such as this one. For English learners, listening to long, structured conversations not only improves comprehension, but also demonstrates how vocabulary, connectors, and sentence patterns are used naturally. When learners see how complex topics like energy, trade, and cooperation are explained step by step in clear English, they can apply similar structures in writing, speaking, and discussions with others, which gradually builds confidence and fluency.
Let's also reflect on the practical benefits for everyday life. Stable energy markets, as we discussed earlier, affect fuel prices, transportation costs, global trade, and even career opportunities. By staying informed about potential changes in countries like Venezuela, learners and everyday people can anticipate future trends, make informed decisions about travel or energy usage, and understand how international developments might affect local economies. The term trend is particularly useful in English because it applies across many contexts, from fashion and social media to markets and technology. So understanding it in an energy context reinforces general vocabulary and comprehension.
Another future consideration is sustainability and environmental awareness, which is becoming increasingly important for energy planning. While oil remains a central part of global energy systems, many countries are also investing in cleaner technologies, renewable energy sources, and more efficient processes. Learners can benefit by understanding terminology like sustainability, renewable energy, and efficiency, which frequently appear in news, education, and international discussions. Connecting these words to energy topics not only improves English skills, but also strengthens awareness of global challenges and solutions.
For English learners, one of the best ways to reinforce today's vocabulary and ideas is to create summaries or mind maps after listening. For example, learners can write down key points about Venezuela's oil potential, refinery compatibility, cooperation benefits, and market limitations, then practice explaining these concepts in their own words. This helps consolidate comprehension, encourages active language use, and strengthens the ability to discuss technical topics in simple, clear English. Listening repeatedly is also beneficial. On a first pass, learners can focus on understanding the general meaning of the conversation. On subsequent listens, they can pay attention to vocabulary, sentence structures, and pronunciation. Later, learners can practice speaking by summarizing the episode aloud or teaching the concepts to someone else, which reinforces retention and fluency. By combining listening, reading, and speaking practice, learners can fully benefit from content like this while developing confidence in understanding complex topics in English. In terms of future energy outlook, the combination of Venezuelan potential, Middle Eastern production, U.S. policy, technological advancements, and market diversification suggests that global supply will likely become more balanced over time, although the pace of change will depend on investments, cooperation agreements, infrastructure improvements, and market demand. For learners, understanding this dynamic context helps make sense of news headlines, encourages critical thinking, and provides a framework for predicting future developments based on evidence, vocabulary, and logical reasoning.
In conclusion, thinking about the future of energy is both practical and educational. For English learners, following these discussions strengthens vocabulary, comprehension, and analytical skills. For professionals, students, and everyday people, understanding energy trends helps plan careers, study choices, and personal decisions. Combining knowledge of global energy markets with long listening practice is a powerful way to enhance English proficiency while staying informed about important real-world topics.
Thank you for joining us in this extended discussion. By examining potential developments in Venezuela, the United States, and the global market, we hope listeners not only learned about energy and cooperation, but also gained new words, phrases, and listening strategies to improve their English. This kind of thoughtful, long-form conversation allows learners to build comprehension, connect ideas, and feel confident discussing complex subjects in simple English.
Keep practicing your listening every day, take notes on new vocabulary, and reflect on how these global topics connect to your own life, career, or studies. By combining curiosity with consistent learning, you are creating a strong foundation for both English language improvement and understanding international developments, which will serve you well in school, work, and everyday life.
As we come to the end of today's long and detailed conversation, it feels helpful to gently bring all the ideas together so listeners can clearly understand the main message of this episode. Throughout our discussion, we explored whether Venezuela could become a meaningful energy partner for the United States and how this possibility connects to global markets, daily life, and long-term planning. We looked at America's current energy system, including domestic production, imports, and the importance of having a diverse set of partners to support stability. We also talked about the Middle East's historical role in the global oil structure, how OPEC helps regulate production, and why the region continues to influence international energy flows. Then, we shifted our attention to Venezuela's enormous potential, its heavy crude resources, its geographic advantages, and the practical challenges it faces with infrastructure and modernization. By connecting all these pieces, we showed listeners how energy cooperation shapes markets, supports economies, and influences the everyday experiences of regular people.
We also examined how recent developments between the United States and Venezuela have opened limited space for temporary cooperation, with both sides exploring ways to stabilize supply while maintaining practical market-focused goals. These steps do not represent a dramatic shift, but instead show how countries sometimes adjust policies to maintain balanced markets during global disruptions. After that, we compared Venezuela with the Middle East, explaining why replacing an entire region is extremely difficult, but increasing supply from multiple partners is realistic. We used simple analogies to show learners how energy systems function like large networks that depend on reliability, planning, and smooth logistics. Then we talked about the benefits and limits of cooperation, including job creation, stable shipping routes, infrastructure needs, refinery compatibility, long-term investments, and global competition. Finally, we explained how all these topics influence everyday life, from fuel prices to travel costs, from business logistics to student opportunities, reminding listeners that global energy decisions are never far from daily reality.
Before we finish, it is useful for English learners to review some of the important vocabulary from this episode. Understanding these terms will help listeners follow international news more easily and build confidence when reading articles or watching documentaries about world events. The first word is energy security, which describes a country's ability to access reliable energy without sudden shortages. The second term is supply chain, which refers to the full journey of a product from production to delivery. The third concept is heavy crude, meaning thick, dense oil that requires special processing. The fourth important word is refining capacity, which describes how much raw oil a refinery can convert into usable fuel. The fifth term is infrastructure, meaning the physical systems, roads, pipelines, ports, storage areas, power lines, that support daily activities and industrial operations.
So when we think about strengthening cooperation, the main idea is balance. There are important benefits, such as job creation, energy security, geographic convenience, and economic stability. There are also clear limits related to infrastructure, refinery compatibility, global competition, and long-term investment requirements. Understanding both sides helps learners see why cooperation grows step by step rather than happening instantly. It is a steady process shaped by technology, economics, and careful planning rather than fast changes.
When we talk about global energy decisions, it can sometimes feel distant, like something that only governments, big companies, or international organizations care about. But the truth is that energy choices affect everyday people in many small ways, from the price they pay for fuel to how much it costs to travel, how products move across borders, how businesses plan their budgets, and even what kinds of study opportunities students can explore if they are interested in technology, engineering, or international trade. So even though our topic today involves countries and oil markets, it actually connects directly to daily life for millions of ordinary people.
One of the clearest examples is fuel prices, because when energy supply becomes more stable, prices usually move in a calmer and more predictable way, which means that when countries diversify their energy partners, consumers may experience fewer sudden price jumps, making it easier to plan monthly expenses, organize family travel, or budget for long commutes. For English learners, the term fuel price simply means the cost of gasoline or diesel that people buy for cars, buses, motorcycles, or trucks. When global conditions are stable, fuel costs are less likely to surprise people, and that stability can give families more confidence in their everyday decisions.
Travel costs are another part of this picture, especially for people who use buses, airplanes, or long-distance transportation. Airlines and bus companies rely heavily on jet fuel or diesel, so when global oil markets are steady, ticket prices tend to remain more predictable. For instance, students who commute to school or workers who take long trips for their jobs can benefit when transportation companies can plan their fuel spending more accurately. This is why many people do not realize they are actually connected to global energy decisions in their daily lives, because a small change in the international oil market can influence the price of a weekend trip, a holiday vacation, or even a delivery fee for online orders.
That brings us to business logistics, another important term for learners. Logistics refers to the entire process of moving goods from one place to another, including transportation, storage, and delivery. Almost every product, food, clothes, electronics, furniture, construction materials, depends on trucks, ships, or planes, and all of these depend on fuel. So when energy supply is reliable, businesses can plan more efficiently, which allows them to keep shelves stocked, deliver products on time, and avoid sudden cost increases. This makes life smoother for customers who expect to find the items they need without major price swings.
Global trade is also deeply connected to energy stability. When energy markets operate smoothly, shipping companies can calculate their costs better, ports can schedule incoming goods more efficiently, and international businesses can sign long-term contracts with confidence. For learners, global trade simply means buying and selling goods between countries. It affects everything from smartphones to farm products to cars. When trade moves steadily, countries benefit, companies grow, and consumers enjoy more choices. Reliable energy supplies help maintain that steady flow, making everyday products more affordable and more accessible worldwide.
Another interesting connection is the impact on students who are thinking about their future careers. Energy is not just about oil. It is also connected to engineering, technology, environmental studies, international relations, and business management. When countries explore cooperation or modernize their energy sectors, they often create opportunities for young people to study new systems, work with advanced equipment, or participate in research projects. Many universities offer programs related to energy policy, petroleum engineering, or sustainable technologies, and these programs often expand when energy industries invest in training the next generation of workers, so global energy decisions can influence what fields of study become attractive or promising for students.
Since this is an English learning podcast, it's also important to connect vocabulary to real-life situations. For example, the term energy security means having a reliable supply of energy, so people do not experience shortages or unstable prices. Supply chain refers to the long process that moves products from the factory to the final customer. Refining capacity means how much oil a facility can convert into usable fuel. When learners understand these words, they can understand international news more easily, participate confidently in global discussions, and read articles about economics or technology without feeling lost.
And when learners hear terms like infrastructure, it simply means the physical systems that support daily life. Roads, ports, pipelines, storage areas, power lines, and transportation networks. These systems help connect communities and keep goods moving. Understanding this vocabulary helps English students recognize how complex global systems operate. And it also helps them make sense of why energy cooperation requires long-term planning rather than quick solutions.
Another important everyday impact is the role energy plays in food prices. Many people do not realize that transportation costs are a big part of the price of fruits, vegetables, grains, and packaged foods. If transportation becomes more expensive because fuel prices rise suddenly, grocery prices can also increase. When global energy markets are balanced, transportation costs remain steadier, which helps the food supply stay affordable and predictable. This is another example of how a topic that might seem distant can actually influence daily life in subtle but meaningful ways.
For English learners living abroad or planning to travel, stable energy markets can also influence the cost of flights, the reliability of public transportation, or the expenses involved in shipping personal items. Many international students depend on affordable travel to visit family or return home during holidays, and stable energy conditions help keep travel options more accessible. So the topic of energy is not just something for experts, it touches the daily routines of students, workers, families, and travelers everywhere.
So when we look at the big question, whether cooperation with Venezuela or any other country can support energy stability, the answer is not only about governments or companies, it is also about helping everyday people experience smoother prices, more dependable transportation, more consistent delivery services, and broader educational opportunities. That connection is what makes global energy topics so important for listeners and learners.
And for English learners, understanding these connections helps build confidence when reading news articles, listening to international discussions, or studying global events, because energy topics appear frequently in journalism, business reports, and academic materials. When learners understand the vocabulary and the real-life meaning behind it, they can participate more actively in global conversations.
As we extend our conversation beyond today's main points, it is useful to consider what the future might hold for Venezuela, the United States, and the global energy market, and how this connects to practical opportunities for learners, professionals, and everyday people who are observing energy trends. Even though we have already discussed current production, infrastructure, cooperation, and challenges, looking ahead allows us to see patterns, potential developments, and ways individuals can benefit from being informed, prepared, and actively learning. Energy systems do not operate in isolation. They are influenced by technology, market trends, environmental considerations, and human decisions, and understanding this bigger picture can make listeners feel more confident when engaging with global topics in English.
One of the first things to consider is technological advancement, because new technologies can change how oil is extracted, refined, transported, and used. For example, improved drilling equipment, upgraded pipelines, and more efficient refineries can increase production and reduce costs. Similarly, technology that monitors global supply in real time allows countries and companies to make faster decisions, which can stabilize prices and support better planning. For English learners, words like advancement and technology appear frequently in news and educational content, and understanding them helps learners follow discussions about innovation and progress across multiple sectors.
Another critical factor for the future is investment and infrastructure modernization, because even the largest reserves, such as those in Venezuela, cannot fully benefit markets without proper facilities, maintenance, and skilled personnel. Investments can come from international companies, partnerships, or government programs, and when these funds are applied strategically, production levels can increase steadily. For learners, the term modernization means updating old systems to meet current standards, and it can be used in many contexts beyond energy, such as transportation, education, or technology. Recognizing such words strengthens vocabulary while providing practical connections to real-world situations.
Continuing our vocabulary review, the sixth important term is logistics, which describes the planning and organization needed to move goods efficiently from one location to another. The seventh term is global trade, which refers to buying and selling goods between countries. The eighth phrase is production levels, meaning the amount of oil or energy a country or company can produce during a certain period. The ninth term is market stability, which describes predictable, steady conditions without extreme price swings. And the 10th word is diversification, meaning the strategy of relying on multiple partners or sources so that no single change can disrupt the entire system. These vocabulary words are extremely common in international news, energy reports, and business discussions, so learning them will help listeners understand real headlines and global events.
For English learners, long listening practice like this episode is valuable because it helps build listening endurance, expand vocabulary, and train the ear to understand natural conversation at a calm pace. When learners listen regularly, their brains begin recognizing patterns, linking new words to familiar ones, and understanding context automatically. This is one of the most effective ways to improve fluency over time. Even if some parts of the conversation feel complex, repeated exposure gradually increases comprehension, and learners begin noticing how words connect to ideas, how speakers explain complicated topics, and how English can be used to explore global issues in a clear and structured way.
Another helpful strategy is to listen to the same episode more than once. On the first listen, learners can focus on the general idea. On the second listen, they can pay attention to vocabulary and expressions. On later listens, they can work on pronunciation, rhythm, and sentence flow. Long-form podcasts like this one provide a rich environment for developing both listening and speaking confidence, because the content is slow, detailed, and designed to be accessible even for beginners who are learning about complex topics for the first time.
For learners who want to continue improving, it can be useful to keep a small notebook or digital file where they write new vocabulary, short summaries of each episode, and personal reflections. This simple habit helps reinforce memory, improves writing skills, and strengthens the connection between what learners hear and what they can produce themselves. Many students find that after a few weeks of consistent listening and writing, their confidence increases noticeably, and they feel more comfortable discussing world events in English.
As we wrap up, the main message of this episode is that global energy discussions are not only about countries and companies, they are also about everyday people, students, workers, travelers, businesses, and families who feel the impact of energy stability in practical ways. Understanding these topics helps listeners become more informed global citizens while also improving their English skills through meaningful real-world content. It is a powerful combination of language learning and global awareness, and we hope it inspires learners to continue exploring more topics with curiosity and confidence.
Thank you for spending this time with us, learning, thinking, and strengthening your English through long, structured listening practice. Conversations like this one help build a strong foundation for future growth, and we appreciate every learner who takes the time to improve their skills with focus and dedication.
We hope today's episode supported your learning journey in a meaningful way. Keep practicing, keep listening, and keep building your confidence step by step. You are making real progress, and we're glad to be part of your learning experience.